Hey guys, this video today falls into the same category as those dug up relics. You remember last week I sent out a video that we talked about relics, Lugers. Here's some pictures of some, but we have Lugers that were found in battlefields, and we've now started putting them on the site so you can check them out if you like. This week we got in a bunch of stuff that I don't collect. So this falls under the category things that I don't collect and I know nothing about. So you can see here we got a bunch of samurai swords in. I can't say no to them. I don't collect them. I know nothing about them, but we did study up a little bit. Some of you can help us out by giving us some information, but we're going to be going over these samurai swords. But before I do, I have two other swords that came in. Now, first of all, this walking stick, this is Yoda's walking stick. At least that's what it reminds me of, but it does have some important history to it, so check this out. So this, I guess, is obviously this is bamboo, and we kept trying to take the top off. We tried unscrewing it, nothing has happened. So it looks like just a walking stick, but this is presented by Marquis Ito to Julian Corcoran. And this is April of 1905, Tokyo, Japan. So a quick check on Marquis Ito. He was actually the first prime minister of Japan in 1905. So he served the emperor. He was in charge of the government, and he oversaw Japan during the defeat of the Russian Navy in the early 1900s, and then the infamous invasion of Korea and their occupation of Korea for many years. Not Johnny Cochran, but Julian Cochran was a famous photographer. So this is the Prime Minister of Japan presenting this to Julian Cochran in 1905. So what I figured out, there was a little hole here, and this little button which fell out, it is broken, but push this button and it opens up into a sword. Yes, indeed. Check that out. Now, if I take this handle off, there is kanji writing, Japanese writing on the inside of who made this. It does have some discoloration, but a very historical piece. It could use a little bit of work. We're not sure of the value, but it's going to be available to somebody. Again, that will just fall out, but somebody could easily repair that. This second sword is even more special, because I'm sure this is Arya Stark's needle. If you know Game of Thrones, Arya Stark used the needle. On a serious note, if you know who this could have been issued to and what era and who made it, I know nothing about this other than it looks like Game of Thrones. Now, let's go check out some samurai swords. You think I didn't know anything about this. It gets worse. We're going to go in the other room. Kurt's going to help me out. We're going to talk about samurai swords.
All right, so here we got a number of blades that recently came in. We've never had this many swords at one time, so we thought it was a great opportunity to show them off in a YouTube video. There's a number of things that you look at on these swords to determine who they were issued to and what they are. About 99% of the swords that collectors today will encounter are going to either be Navy Type 97s or Army Type 98 officers' swords. And these refer to the modern era, basically anything made from 1900 to 1945 or present day. Those are considered modern swords because the Japanese were making these since the 1300s, since the days of the samurai. And they've changed a lot over the years, but Japan considers these swords to be national treasures, national artifacts. So there's a lot of meaning and history behind these swords, and there's a lot of Japanese tradition that goes into the different styles of sword and how they were made and by whom. So we mostly focus on World War II, and during World War II, most of the blades were factory made, meaning they were made in a Japanese factory and given out to junior officers and officers as a symbol, kind of like you would have a rank on your uniform. It's understood that the Japanese still gave some swordsmiths the tools and materials to create handmade swords during World War II. Because Japan had some handmade blades during World War II that were still given to officers, those are the ones that collectors seek out and go for a lot more money than the factory-made blades. And there's a couple things we can look for. It's not a science, it's more you have to piece together what the signals are indicating, whether it's handmade or factory-made. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive and see what we can find out. So what we have here are Army and Navy officers' samurai swords from World War II. These with a single hanger are Army, whereas the Type 97s, the Navies, have two hangers on the scabbard. That's the number one easiest way to determine whether it's a Navy sword or an Army sword. Unlike the Germans, where there's far fewer Navy-issued items than Army, there's actually more of the Type 97 Navy Japanese swords produced during World War II than the Army Type 98 swords produced. There's different types of scabbard for the Army. Here's an example of this would be considered a field scabbard, the ones wrapped in leather. So there's an example here, and there's an example here, and here's yet another example of how the leather wrapping was for field use. Some of the swords have a tassel on them, and the blue and brown would signify a junior officer. I think the tassels with red in them are a senior officer. So we'll just run with this one. This is a junior officer's sword. What we see here is a standard fitting for a Type 98 Army officer sword. The wrap is over top of ray or shark skin. Remember, Japan is an island nation, so using shark and ray skin was a lot easier than leather for the Japanese to come by. So all the wraps are over either ray or shark skin. This one here, you see, this is the tsuba, or the handguard. This one is a more commonly issued tsuba. A more desirable or detailed tsuba would look like this, where you have kind of cut out chrysanthemums. You notice how there's a little bit more attention to detail here on this one. This one is a more desirable tsuba. And the next thing we're going to want to look at on these, some of them have the scabbard release button and some of them do not. And I'm not really sure the significance of whether it has one or not, what that means. But so now that we have the blade out of the scabbard, you see a few things. And this is where we start to draw the conclusion of whether this is factory or handmade. So this one, I can tell it's factory by looking at the hamon, which is the tempered steel line along the edge. It's really hard to get a good photo of it or get a good angle. We're going to do our best, and maybe Randy can post up some additional photos, some still shots of what I'm talking about as I talk. But you look at the hamon, and a lot of the water-quenched blades, this one included, you can kind of see a little bit of a deeper white behind the initial line of tempered steel. And that tells you that this was water quenched versus oil quenched. The important thing, or the spark notes for you, is that the tempered edge on a handmade blade is going to look a lot less uniform than the tempered edge on a factory-made blade. The other important thing you look for on the blade itself would be graining. Kind of like how wood has a unique graining to it. The type of steel the Japanese used for their handmade blades was a specific kind of steel only found in Japan. and they sourced this steel to make their handmade blades. And only handmade blades will have the graining feature on it, and the term for the grain is the hata. So you look for hata. This one does not have any graining on it, so that's almost like the kiss of death. It already tells me this is factory made. So in order to take these apart, you take out the little wooden peg called the makugi. You get that makugi out, and then the blade should separate from the fittings. Sometimes it needs a little tap from the soft side of a mechanic's hammer, but usually a little bit of wiggling and force, you can get the fittings off. I like to keep them all together because there's usually multiple buffer rings. There's the suba, and then there's one ring, 2 rings there. But what's important that we just revealed underneath is the tang. Now the tang will have a signature, and this is where it becomes a little bit hazy. It's not scientific, as I said. It's a little bit of piecing together what the puzzle gives you. When collectors first started looking at these, they would see the signature, get it translated, and then say, oh, it's this maker, and it was handmade by this maker, as shown by the signature. Well, the signatures, the Japanese wanted to, they're a very traditional culture, and they wanted to honor the traditional way of making these swords, so even the factory-made blades have a signature on them. It's a machined-in signature. You'll even see sometimes they have 2 holes in the tang. Again, that's because they're trying to recreate the older style of blade, or a more traditional looking tang. It's all still factory made or machine made. So this tang here, it has a signature. There's no factory stamp. Sometimes there is a factory stamp, and that's your dead giveaway that it was factory made. There are 2 stamps. One's a star. The other is a half chrysanthemum with some S's underneath, I guess you could say, or squiggly lines underneath. But those 2 are handmade blades, and we can show you examples of that. But this one just has a signature on each side of the tang, but no factory stamp. The patina is a good thing to look for on the tang because it can help you date blades as well. It's almost like the darker the patina, the older the blade. So this one has, I would call, a light brown patina throughout the tang. Tells me that this one was probably a 1930s or 40s production, which makes sense because of the fittings and the size and style of blade. These 2 have squared off handles. These are family swords, and most swords made prior to the war in the Pacific, almost all Japanese swords were family swords, meaning they were handmade and either given to or made for a family, and it was passed down as a family heirloom from generation to generation. These are good examples because you can see right away they have squared off handles. They also have different length blades. These were custom made, handmade blades. So the scabbards are also handmade or custom made for the blade. Moving along, we see here are 2 examples of Type 97 Navy swords. So these are naval officers. Both of these have factory-made blades. Not only do the Navy swords have 2 rings on the scabbard, but they also have a different style suba than the Type 98.
So Kurt, what is the price difference, say, between a Navy and an Army issued sword?
There really isn't much of a difference in price. They go for about the same, and part of that I think is there's not as many Japanese sword collectors as there are collectors for the German memorabilia. But as I said earlier, there's actually more Navy swords than Army swords that were produced, but they both go for about the same.
So what's the price range on these? Because it seems like I see prices all over the place.
Because they are, and it really does range dramatically based on condition. The moment a collector sees a blade with scratch marks on it or any type of pitting, it's just going to completely destroy the collector value. The collectors really go for the blade because the fittings, the scabbard, all the extra stuff on top of the blade can easily get swapped out, and it was swapped out during the war and through the years of collecting. So the blade is where the value lies.
So like a party leader grip, that's where all the money is.
Exactly.
And they put a party leader grip on their best PPK, so that's a good analogy for me.
Exactly. And so that's why it's so important to be able to determine a factory from a handmade blade. Now, I showed you a factory blade. It didn't have the factory stamp that I was looking for, which was a little disappointing. But I'll show you a handmade blade so we can see the difference, hopefully, in what I was talking about. So I picked up, this is a handmade Type 97 Navy sword. You usually want to open it with the blade pointing upward. These blades are extremely sharp. So this one, handmade, but if you look up towards the tip, I don't know if you can get a good look at that, Randy. You can see there's some wear imperfections along the edge. Maybe someone played with this as a child. So this is an example of a handmade blade, and it's also an example of why this can be so difficult for collectors today. So this one is handmade. You can see it's got a nice tempered edge. The most important thing you want to look at on this one is you can tell there's a little bit of graining. It's really hard to pick up on the camera, but it almost looks like wood graining in the steel. It's a really subtle, wavy lines, kind of like what you see in wood, and it runs between the tempered edge and the spine of the blade. So not to be confused with patina, but it is kind of like a little bit of a speckling, wavy line that runs through the steel. The reason why this one can be hard and a little misleading is if you look on the tang here, my first reaction was, well, this must be factory made because of how you can see the rough machine lines for the signature there. But this one I know is handmade because of the graining, and the graining is kind of the trump card. If it has the graining, then it doesn't really matter. But this also kind of goes to prove the theory that they were making them by hand during World War II, but there was demand and there was production demand. So they were making them by hand, but it was kind of a rushed production is our understanding, which is why you have such a crude looking signature on the blade, or on the tang rather, sorry.
So this is why these are things I don't collect. I don't know enough about them, but just like a Luger collector, somebody who doesn't know anything about Lugers, they pick the prettiest one, so they often get like a refinished gun. I picked this one because it's got this really cool writing on it, and I think, oh, this is really cool. It's like a piece of history. So we don't know what this says, and Randy, come check this out, and maybe somebody can help us. It might say made in China, but I like this one the best just because of the little piece of history there. So help us out. Hey, thanks for watching, and thank you, Kurt, for all your help on this. I know there's a lot more to learn, but at least we did a broad brush, and we'll continue that in the future. Some people say, why do you have things you don't know anything about? Well, we don't know a lot about a lot of things we sell, but we look forward to your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe to our channel, and we'll do this again soon.